there is a quiet possibility that your body is not entirely aligned with the world you are living in. Not in a dramatic way, but in small, almost unnoticeable responses. The way your breathing changes, the way your body reacts to cold, to height, to unfamiliar environments. These reactions can feel natural, as if they belong to you, but some of them may have been shaped long before your own life began, under conditions that no longer exist. They may come from a time when humans were not a single kind, but several, sharing the same landscapes without fully becoming one. Those other humans are no longer here, and yet something of them may still remain, not as a story, but as a function within your body. If your body can carry traces of a world that has already disappeared, then what exactly is it still holding on to without you ever noticing? Why does your body still remember a species that disappeared 50,000 years ago? It is easy to assume that your body belongs entirely to the present moment, that every reaction you feel, every adjustment your body makes, is a direct response to the world you are living in now. When you feel cold, you might reach for warmth. When you feel tired, your body slows down. These responses seem immediate, simple, and personal. They feel like they belong only to you, but there is a quieter layer beneath that surface, one that does not announce itself clearly. Some of these responses may not have been shaped by your life alone, but by conditions that existed long before you were born, in environments that no longer exist in the same way today. The body you are experiencing right now did not begin with you. It is part of a much longer process, one that stretches back through many generations, through changing climates, shifting landscapes, and forms of life that have since disappeared. If we look far enough back, toward the earliest origins of our species, we begin to see that the human body was shaped in a world very different from the one we know today. Early humans did not live in stable environments. Temperatures shifted, food sources changed, and survival depended on constant adjustment. Over time, the body learned to respond, not just to one environment but to many. These responses were not stored as memories in the way we think of remembering. They became patterns, embedded in how the body functions. Even now, in a modern setting, your body continues to use systems that were formed under those earlier conditions. Some of these systems fit the present well enough that we do not question them. Others feel slightly out of place, but still familiar. When your body reacts in a way that seems unnecessary or difficult to explain, it may not be a mistake. It may be a response that once made sense in a different world. As human populations moved and spread across different regions, they encountered new climates, new terrains, and new challenges. These changes did not happen all at once. They unfolded slowly, over thousands of years, allowing the body to adjust in gradual ways. But not all of those adjustments came from a single line of development. There were moments in this long history where different groups of humans existed at the same time, sharing similar spaces without being identical. These groups were shaped by different conditions, and their bodies carried different adaptations. Some were better suited to cold, others to high altitudes, others to entirely different patterns of life. When these groups encountered one another, the boundaries between them were not always fixed. There is evidence that suggests interactions were not only limited to shared environments, but extended into biological exchange. This means that some of the traits that exist in modern humans today may not come from a single, continuous line, but from multiple sources that once existed side by side. If we return again to the present moment, to something as simple as how your body feels right now, it becomes less certain that every function belongs solely to the world you are in. The way your body responds to thin air, to unfamiliar temperatures, or to certain biological stresses may carry influences from conditions you have never personally experienced. These are not conscious memories. You do not recall them, and you do not need to. They exist as part of how your body operates, quietly, consistently, without explanation. This is where the idea begins to shift slightly. Your body is not only a reflection of your own life, but a continuation of a much older process, one that includes environments that no longer exist and forms of human life that are no longer present in the world. If that is the case, then the body you experience each day may be holding on to patterns that were shaped in a time when humans were not a single, unified group. And if those patterns are still active now, even in small and subtle ways, then it becomes possible that your body is not only responding to the present, but also carrying forward something that has not entirely disappeared. even if the world it came from is no longer here. If you remain still for a moment and notice your body without trying to change anything, certain patterns begin to appear. Your breathing rises and falls in a steady rhythm. Your body maintains its temperature without your attention. Even in rest, there is a quiet activity continuing beneath awareness. These processes feel stable, as if they belong to a well-adjusted system. But if we shift the perspective slightly, they begin to look less like perfect solutions and more like ongoing adjustments. The human body is not designed for a single, fixed environment. It is shaped by the need to respond to variation. And that need did not begin recently. It reaches back to a time when survival depended on responding to constant change. Early human environments were not controlled or predictable. Temperature could drop suddenly, food availability could shift without warning, and landscapes could transform across generations. In those conditions, the body did not aim for comfort. It aimed for continuity. Systems that could adjust, even imperfectly, were carried forward. Systems that could not were gradually lost. If we consider the origins of our species, we begin to see that the body's current stability is built on layers of past instability. Each layer reflects a response to a different set of conditions. Some of those conditions still exist in parts of the world. Others have disappeared or changed beyond recognition. Yet the responses remain. This is where a subtle tension appears. The body continues to operate using patterns that were shaped in environments that no longer match the present. This does not always create visible problems. Often, the mismatch is small, almost unnoticeable, but it can be felt in moments when the body reacts in ways that seem slightly out of place. A sudden sensitivity to cold, even in a mild climate, a difficulty adjusting to altitude, a pattern of fatigue that does not align with modern schedules. These are not necessarily errors. They can be traces of a system that was formed under different conditions. As human populations spread across different regions, the diversity of environments increased. Some groups lived in colder climates, others in warmer regions, others in areas where oxygen levels were lower. Over long periods of time, bodies adapted to these conditions in specific ways, but these adaptations did not remain isolated. When groups came into contact, the exchange was not only cultural or environmental. There is evidence that biological exchange also occurred. This means that some of the responses present in modern human bodies may not have originated from a single lineage. Instead, they may reflect a combination of adaptations that were once separated by geography and time. If we return again to the present, to the quiet processes happening in your body right now, it becomes possible to see them in a different way. The rhythm of your breathing, the way your body regulates temperature, the way it responds to changes in the environment, these are not simply features of a modern system. They are part of a longer continuity. Each response carries with it a history that extends beyond individual experience, and that history does not always align neatly with the world you are in today. The body does not reset itself with each generation. It carries forward what has worked well enough to continue. This means that some parts of your body may still be responding to conditions that are no longer present, not because the body is outdated, but because it is continuous. It preserves what allows survival, even if the original context has changed. This continuity can create a quiet sense of misalignment. Not something dramatic, but something subtle. A feeling that the body is slightly out of sync with its surroundings. This is not something most people notice directly. It is too gradual, too embedded. But if we follow this idea back toward the deeper past, toward the time when multiple human groups existed side by side, the picture becomes more complex. The continuity of the body may include influences from more than one source. And if that is the case, then the patterns you experience today may not come from a single uninterrupted line, but from a history where different forms of human life contributed to what the body has become. There is a way to notice this quiet continuity without needing to look far beyond your own experience. It appears in the moments when your body responds before you have time to think. A slight change in air, and your breathing adjusts. A shift in temperature, and your body begins to regulate itself without instruction. These responses feel immediate, but they are not created in the moment. They are the result of systems that have been carried forward over long periods of time, shaped by conditions that are no longer fully present. If we follow this idea further back, toward the deeper origins of human life, it becomes clearer that the body was not formed in a single stable environment. It was shaped through movement, through gradual shifts in climate, and through encounters with landscapes that required constant adjustment. Over thousands of years, these adjustments became part of how the body functions. They did not disappear when the environment changed. They remained, even as the conditions that created them faded away. This creates a situation where the body is always slightly ahead of the present, or slightly behind it. It carries responses that once had a clear purpose, even if that purpose is no longer obvious. As human populations continued to spread, they did not move through empty space. They entered regions where other human groups were already living, groups that had adapted to those environments over long periods of time. These groups were not identical, and their bodies reflected different histories. Some had adapted to colder climates, others to higher elevations, others to patterns of life that are difficult to fully reconstruct now. When these groups encountered each other, the outcome was not always separation. There were points of contact, and in some cases, biological exchange. This does not need to be imagined in detail to be understood. It is enough to recognize that the human story is not a single line moving forward in isolation. It is a network of paths that sometimes crossed, sometimes merged, and sometimes continued in parallel before fading. When we look at the present again, at the body as it is now, it becomes possible that some of the patterns it carries do not come from one continuous source. They may come from different branches of that network, from groups that no longer exist as distinct populations, but have left traces behind. These traces are not visible in the way we usually think of history. They are not written, and they are not remembered consciously. They are expressed through function, through the way the body responds to the world. A certain tolerance to altitude, a particular way of regulating temperature, a response to environmental stress that does not seem to match current conditions. These may all be part of a longer history that the body continues to carry forward. This does not mean that the body is confused or incomplete. It means that it is cumulative. It holds on to what has been useful, even if the original context is no longer clear. In this way, the body becomes less like a finished form and more like an ongoing record, one that is written not in words, but in processes. If we consider this carefully, a quiet shift in perspective begins to take place. The body is not only shaped by a direct line of ancestors leading to the present, it may also include influences from groups that no longer exist in the way they once did. Groups that shared the same world, adapted to different conditions, and then gradually disappeared as separate identities. Yet something of them may still remain, carried forward not as a visible presence, but as a subtle influence within the body itself. And if that is the case, then the body you experience now may be holding on to more than a single history. It may be carrying fragments of multiple pasts, layered together in ways that are not immediately visible, but still quietly active. It can feel natural to think of human history as a single, continuous line, a gradual movement from the past toward the present, where each generation replaces the one before it, leading steadily to what we are now. This idea is simple, and it is easy to hold on to. But when we look more carefully at the deeper past, especially at the earliest stages of human development, the picture becomes less straightforward. Instead of a single line, there were periods where multiple forms of humans existed at the same time, sharing parts of the same world without being identical to one another. This does not require imagining large differences at first. In many ways, these groups would have appeared similar, moving through landscapes, responding to the same environmental pressures, adapting in ways that allowed them to continue. But beneath those similarities, there were differences shaped by long periods of separation. Different climates, different terrains, and different patterns of life created variations in how their bodies functioned. These were not separate in the way we think of entirely different species in a modern sense. They were close enough to share a common origin, yet distinct enough to carry their own adaptations. If we move back toward the origins of Homo sapiens, the group that eventually became dominant, we find that they did not emerge into an empty world. Other human groups were already present in different regions. Some had been there for much longer, adapting slowly over time to very specific conditions. This means that the early expansion of Homo sapiens was not simply a process of moving into unoccupied space. It was a process of entering environments where other forms of human life had already established themselves. These encounters are not always visible in the way history is usually recorded. There are no written accounts, no direct descriptions, but there are patterns that can be observed through careful study of physical remains and, more importantly, through the structure of modern human DNA. These patterns suggest that the relationships between these groups were not limited to simple replacement. In some cases, there were interactions that left lasting biological traces. This is where the idea begins to shift again. The presence of multiple human groups at the same time means that the story of human development is not only about change over time, but also about coexistence. Different groups experience the same broad periods of history in their own ways, shaped by their environments and their adaptations. Some of these groups eventually disappeared as distinct populations. Their physical forms are no longer present in the world, but disappearance does not always mean complete absence. If we return to the present, to the body as it is now, it becomes possible that some of the variations within modern humans are connected to those earlier forms of coexistence, not as visible differences that can be easily identified, but as subtle variations in how the body functions. The ability to respond to different environmental conditions, the way the body handles stress, the way it adjusts to changes in altitude or temperature, these may all reflect a history that includes more than one source. This does not mean that modern humans are divided into separate groups in the same way as those earlier populations. Over time, boundaries have shifted, merged, and become less distinct. But the underlying contributions may still remain, carried forward through generations. The idea that there were once multiple forms of humans living at the same time challenges the sense of simplicity that we often associate with our origins. It suggests that the human story is not only about survival and progression, but also about interaction, overlap, and gradual merging. And if that is the case, then the body you experience today may be shaped not only by a single path leading to the present, but by a more complex history, where different forms of human life once existed side by side, leaving traces that have not entirely disappeared. If we slow down and imagine the world as it was tens of thousands of years ago, it does not appear as a place shaped by a single kind of human. Instead, it becomes a landscape where different groups moved across the same earth, often without clear boundaries separating them. These groups did not exist in isolation from the environment, and they did not exist in isolation from one another. They were shaped by where they lived, by the climates they endured, and by the resources they depended on. Over long periods of time, these conditions created subtle differences in how their bodies functioned. Not differences that would immediately separate them in a clear and simple way, but differences that accumulated slowly, forming distinct patterns within each group. Some lived in colder regions, where maintaining body heat required different responses. Others lived at higher elevations, where the air was thinner and the body had to adjust to lower levels of oxygen. Still others adapted to entirely different ecological systems, where food, movement, and survival followed different rhythms. These adaptations were not choices. They were the result of gradual processes, where certain traits became more common because they allowed survival in those specific conditions. If we look again toward the origins of Homo sapiens, we see a group that eventually expanded across many regions. But this expansion was not uniform, and it did not erase what came before in a simple or immediate way. As Homo sapiens moved into new areas, they encountered groups that had already adapted to those environments over long periods of time. These encounters were not always direct or continuous, and the details are not fully known, but the existence of multiple human groups in overlapping regions suggests that there were points of contact. Not all of these contacts resulted in lasting change. Some may have been brief, others may have had little effect, but there is evidence that, in certain cases, these interactions included biological exchange. This idea does not require imagining specific events or assigning clear outcomes. It is enough to understand that the boundaries between these groups were not always fixed. Where there is overlap, there is the possibility of exchange. And when that exchange occurs, it can leave traces that persist long after the original groups are no longer present. If we return again to the present, to the body as it functions now, it becomes possible to see how this layered history might still be reflected in subtle ways. The way your body responds to different environments may not come from a single source. It may be influenced by adaptations that were developed in different places, under different conditions, by groups that once existed alongside each other. These influences are not visible in a direct way. You cannot feel them as separate parts. They are integrated into the overall functioning of the body, forming a system that appears unified, even if its origins are more complex. This creates a quiet sense of continuity that extends beyond individual experience. The body does not carry a clear record of where each trait comes from. It carries the result of many overlapping processes, shaped by time, movement, and interaction. When we consider this carefully, the idea of a single, uninterrupted human path becomes less certain. Instead, what appears is a pattern of coexistence and gradual merging, where different groups contributed to what would eventually become the modern human body. These contributions were not preserved as distinct identities. They were absorbed, integrated, and carried forward in ways that are not immediately visible. And yet, they may still influence how the body responds to the world, even now, even in environments that are very different from those in which those adaptations first emerged. If we continue to follow this idea, the image of the past becomes less like a sequence and more like a layered space. Different groups of humans were not simply replacing one another in a clear order. In many regions, they were present at the same time, moving through similar environments, adapting in parallel rather than in isolation. This does not mean they were constantly interacting. There may have been long periods where groups remained separate, shaped by their own conditions, developing their own patterns of survival. But the possibility of overlap changes how we understand what came later. When populations share space, even briefly, the boundary between them becomes less absolute. Over time, this can lead to a gradual blending, not always visible, not always complete, but enough to leave traces that continue beyond the moment of contact. If we look toward the earliest origins of Homo sapiens, we find a group that began in a particular region and then expanded outward over many thousands of years. This expansion was not a single event, and it did not move at a constant pace. It unfolded slowly, with movements that were sometimes forward, sometimes paused, and sometimes redirected by changing conditions. As these movements reached new regions, they encountered environments that had already shaped other human groups for long periods of time. These groups were not temporary. They had their own histories, their own adaptations, and their own ways of responding to the world. Some were better suited to cold, others to altitude, others to conditions that are difficult to fully reconstruct today. When we consider what happens in these moments of overlap, it becomes clear that the outcome is not always simple replacement. In some cases, one group may have gradually disappeared as a distinct population, but disappearance does not always mean that every trace is lost. If there was even limited exchange, then some aspects of those groups could continue, carried forward within the populations that remained. This continuation does not preserve the group as it once was. It does not maintain a separate identity. Instead, it becomes part of a larger system, integrated into the functioning of bodies that belong to a different time. If we return once more to the present, to something as immediate as the way your body responds to its environment, this idea begins to take on a more concrete form. The way your body handles certain stresses, the way it adjusts to unfamiliar conditions, may reflect influences that do not come from a single source. They may be the result of a long process in which different adaptations were combined, carried forward, and reshaped across generations. These influences are not something you can separate or identify directly. They are part of a system that appears unified because it functions as a whole, but within that unity there may be layers that come from different points in the past, from groups that once existed alongside each other and then gradually disappeared as distinct populations. This creates a subtle shift in how we understand the body. It is not only the result of a single line of inheritance moving forward through time, it is also the result of intersections, of moments where different paths came into contact and left something behind. Those moments are not visible in a direct way. They are not recorded in memory or preserved in a form that can be easily observed, but they may still be present in how the body operates, in ways that feel natural, even if their origins are not immediately clear. And if the body carries these layered influences, then it becomes possible that what we experience as a single, continuous human form is actually the result of multiple histories, combined and carried forward into the present, long after the groups that contributed to it have disappeared from the world as separate beings. There is a point in this long history where the traces become unusually faint. not completely absent but difficult to see in the ways we are used to observing the past. Most of what we know about earlier human groups comes from physical remains, bones, tools, fragments of daily life that survived long enough to be discovered. These pieces allow us to form a partial picture, to understand where certain groups lived and how they may have moved through their environments. But there are moments where this approach reaches its limit, where the physical record becomes too sparse to follow clearly. It is in this space of limited visibility that one particular group begins to appear, not through a complete set of remains, but through something far less direct. This group is known as the Denisovans. What makes them different is not only when they lived, but how they were identified. Unlike other human groups that are known from relatively larger collections of fossils, the Denisovans were first recognized through a very small number of physical fragments. A piece of bone, a tooth, materials that on their own would not seem enough to describe an entire population. And yet, through careful analysis, these fragments revealed something that could not be easily explained by known human groups. The structure of their DNA showed patterns that were distinct, not fully matching what had been seen in Homo sapiens or in other well-studied groups like Neanderthals. This created a situation that was both quiet and significant. A group of humans had been present in the past, but had left behind so little visible evidence that they might have remained unnoticed if not for the information contained within those fragments. This does not mean that they were rare or insignificant. It means that the conditions required for physical preservation were not always present, or that the materials that could have told their story did not survive. The absence of evidence is not the same as absence of existence. If we move back toward the broader context of human origins, this becomes easier to understand. Many environments do not preserve organic material well. Over tens of thousands of years, bones can break down, landscapes can shift, and traces can disappear. What remains is often only a small part of what once existed. In the case of the Denisovans, what remains is enough to suggest that they were part of this larger network of human groups that shared the world during that time. They were not isolated in a way that separates them completely from others. Their existence fits within the pattern of coexistence that we have already begun to see. What makes them different is that their presence is revealed more through genetic information than through physical form. If we return to the present, this creates an unusual connection. A group that is almost invisible in the physical record may still be detectable through the structure of modern human DNA. This does not mean that every detail is known or that their way of life can be fully reconstructed. Many aspects remain uncertain, and careful interpretation is required to avoid drawing conclusions that go beyond the evidence. But the existence of their genetic signature suggests that they were not entirely separate from the processes that shaped modern humans. There were points of contact, moments where boundaries were crossed in ways that allowed biological exchange to occur. This exchange is not visible in the way we usually think of interaction. It does not leave behind objects or written accounts. It leaves behind patterns within the body itself, patterns that can persist long after the original group has disappeared as a distinct population. If we consider this carefully, the idea introduced earlier begins to take on a more defined shape. The body may carry influences from groups that are no longer visible in the world, not because they were insignificant, but because their traces are preserved in a different form. The Denisovans represent one of the clearest examples of this possibility, a group that is almost absent in the physical record, yet still present in a subtle and measurable way within the bodies of some modern humans. And if that is the case, then the body becomes not only a continuation of a known past, but also a connection to parts of history that are only partially visible, carried forward quietly, without clear boundaries, and without direct awareness. When the first fragments connected to the Denisovans were examined more closely, what stood out was not their size or shape, but the information hidden within them. A small piece of bone and a tooth did not offer much in terms of visible detail. They did not immediately reveal how these individuals moved, what they looked like, or how they lived from day to day. In that sense, they remained quiet, almost anonymous within the physical record. But when their genetic material was analyzed, a different kind of presence began to emerge. The patterns found in that DNA did not align fully with what had already been identified in Homo sapiens, nor did they match the sequences known from Neanderthals. Instead, they formed a distinct line, one that suggested a separate group within the broader human family. This discovery did not create a complete picture. It did not suddenly fill in all the missing details, but it shifted the way the past could be understood. It showed that even when physical evidence is limited, there are other ways to detect the existence of a group that once lived. This is important because it changes how absence is interpreted. A lack of visible remains no longer means that nothing was there. It may simply mean that the evidence has taken a different form, one that requires a different kind of observation. If we move back again to the deeper history of human origins, this idea becomes more consistent with what we already know about how the past is preserved. Environments do not treat all materials equally. Some conditions allow bones to remain intact for long periods of time. Others break them down quickly, leaving little behind. Over tens of thousands of years, even large populations can leave only small traces if the conditions are not right. This means that the physical record is always incomplete. It reflects what was preserved, not everything that existed. The Denisovans fit into this pattern in a particular way. Their physical remains are limited, but their genetic presence is clearer. This suggests that they were part of the same broad network of human groups that shared the world during that time, even if the details of their daily lives are not fully visible. What can be observed with more confidence is that their DNA carries information that is distinct enough to identify them as a separate group. This distinction is not absolute in the sense of being completely isolated. There are also signs that their genetic material did not remain confined to a single population. Instead, parts of it appear in some modern human groups, indicating that there were moments in the past where exchange occurred. This exchange does not need to be imagined in detail. It is enough to recognize that when different groups exist in overlapping regions, the possibility of interaction includes more than shared space. Over long periods of time, even limited contact can leave lasting biological traces. If we return to the present, this creates a quiet connection between a group that is almost invisible in the physical record and the bodies of people living today. The connection is not something that can be seen directly. It does not appear in a way that separates individuals into clear categories. It is subtle, integrated into the overall structure of the body. Certain genetic patterns, inherited across many generations, continue to exist without drawing attention to themselves. They do not carry a visible label. They simply function as part of the system. This brings us back to the idea that the body is not only shaped by what is immediately visible in the past, it is also shaped by influences that are preserved in less obvious ways. The Denisovans represent one of the clearest examples of this. A group known more through genetic information than through physical remains, yet still connected to the present through the continuity of the body. And if their presence can be detected in this way, it suggests that the boundary between what has disappeared and what remains is not always as clear as it seems. What makes the Denisovans feel so unusual in this story is not only that they disappeared, but that they remain difficult to picture with confidence. With many ancient human groups, even when knowledge is incomplete, there is still some sense of physical presence. Bones, skull fragments, tools, and living spaces allow a partial outline to form. We may not know everything, but we can still imagine a body moving through a place. With the Denisovans, that outline is much fainter. They are known through remarkably limited physical remains, and this changes the emotional shape of the story. They are not absent, but they are difficult to hold in the mind in the way we usually hold the past. Their presence comes to us in a quieter form, through genetic traces that do not show a face, a posture, or a full body. This makes them feel almost less like a lost population in the ordinary sense, and more like a hidden layer inside the broader history of humanity. If we step back toward the deeper origins of our species, this faintness begins to make more sense. The human past was not preserved evenly. Some places kept bones and tools for long periods, other places did not. Some groups left remains that happened to survive in conditions that allowed discovery. Others may have been just as real, just as widespread in their own regions, but left behind far less that could endure across tens of thousands of years. This means that what we know today is partly shaped by survival of evidence, not only by survival of populations. The Denisovans remind us of that limit. They show that a human group can have a real place in history even if its physical outline remains incomplete. And yet, in another sense, they are not faint at all. Once their DNA was examined, their presence became clearer in a different way. Not clearer as an image, but clearer as a biological reality. Their genetic material revealed that they were not simply a variation within a known group, and not merely a minor extension of what had already been mapped. They belonged to a distinct branch within the larger human family. This did not answer every question. It did not tell us exactly how they lived, what language-like sounds they may have made, or how they understood their surroundings. Those are areas where caution remains necessary. But it did show that the human past contained more diversity than the older, simpler model had assumed. It also showed that a group can vanish from ordinary view and still remain detectable in the body. If we return again to the present, this is where the Denisovans begin to matter in a more intimate way. Their importance is not only that they existed, but that some of their genetic traces appear in certain modern human populations today. This does not mean that their identity survived unchanged. It does not mean they are still present as a separate people hidden within the modern world. What remains is more subtle than that. Small inherited traces, carried across many generations, integrated into the bodies of people living now. The body does not announce where these traces came from. It does not separate them into visible layers. They are simply part of how the organism functions, like an old current still moving beneath a newer surface. This changes the meaning of disappearance. In everyday language, to disappear means to be gone, but in the deeper history of human life, disappearance can be less complete. A group may vanish as a distinct population, no longer visible in the world as it once was, and yet still continue in fragments, carried forward in the biology of others. The Denisovans fit this pattern in a striking way. Their physical remains are limited, their image uncertain, and many details about their lives remain open to careful study. Yet their genetic presence suggests that they were not cut off from the broader human story. They were part of it, and some part of that involvement still persists. If we think about this slowly, the feeling is slightly unsettling in a quiet way. The body you live in each day may include influences from people who are almost missing from the visible record of history. Not legendary beings, not imagined ancestors, but a real human group known through evidence that is accepted because it can be measured, compared, and traced. That does not turn the body into a mystery in the dramatic sense. It makes it something more layered than it first appears. It suggests that the body is carrying not only the clear lines of known ancestry, but also faint continuities from populations that the Earth did not preserve well, yet did not erase completely. And in that sense, the Denisovans begin to stand at the edge of visibility, no longer fully present, no longer entirely gone, but still close enough to the living body that history cannot be said to have left them behind. There is a moment, not in the distant past, but in the process of studying the human body itself, where something begins to feel slightly out of place. When scientists look at the genetic structure of modern humans, they expect to see patterns that follow a general continuity, small variations shaped by time, environment, and movement. Most of these variations can be traced back through known lines of ancestry, forming a picture that, while complex, still holds together in a consistent way. But within that structure, there are fragments that do not fit as neatly. They appear as segments of DNA that are clearly human, yet do not align fully with what would be expected from a single continuous development of Homo sapiens alone. These segments are not large or obvious in a way that would immediately draw attention. They are subtle, embedded within the larger system, and only become noticeable through careful comparison across many individuals and populations. At first, such differences could be interpreted in simple ways. Variation within a species is normal, and small differences can emerge over time without requiring a deeper explanation. But as more data was gathered and patterns were compared across wider groups, certain segments began to show a consistency that suggested something more than random variation. They appeared in specific populations more often than others, and their structure pointed toward a source that did not fully match the known genetic profile of modern humans. This is where the sense of continuity begins to shift again. The human genome, rather than being a single uninterrupted line, shows signs of having incorporated elements from outside its immediate path. Not in a way that breaks its identity, but in a way that adds layers to it. These layers are not visible in daily life. You do not feel them as separate parts, and they do not create a sense of division within the body, but at the level of genetic structure, they are present, forming part of the overall system. If we return to the deeper origins of our species, this becomes easier to understand. Homo sapiens did not evolve in complete isolation from all other human groups. As we have already seen, there were periods of overlap, times when different populations shared the same regions. In those conditions, the boundary between groups was not always absolute. When contact occurred, it was possible for genetic material to move from one group to another, becoming part of the receiving population. Over time, this material would be carried forward, passed through generations, and integrated into the broader genetic structure. What makes this process difficult to see without careful study is that it does not leave clear external markers. The body continues to function as a unified system. The inherited material does not remain separate or isolated. It becomes part of the whole, contributing in ways that are often subtle. But when analyzed at a detailed level, these contributions can still be detected. Certain sequences of DNA stand out because they do not match the expected pattern of inheritance from known Homo sapiens populations alone. They point toward interactions with other human groups that are no longer present in their original form. If we bring this idea back to the present moment, it creates a quiet shift in how the body can be understood. The body is not only a continuation of a single line of ancestry. It may also include elements that originated outside that line, incorporated through past interactions that are no longer visible in any direct way. These elements do not define the body as something separate. They are part of its continuity, but they also suggest that the history carried within the body is more complex than it appears on the surface. And if certain segments of DNA do not fully belong to the expected pattern of modern human development, then they may be remnants of connections that once existed between different human groups, connections that have since faded from view, leaving behind only these quiet, measurable traces within the structure of the body itself. When these unusual segments were examined more closely, their differences became clearer, not in a dramatic way, but in a pattern that repeated across many observations. Researchers compared DNA from modern human populations across different regions and began to notice that certain sequences appeared consistently in some groups while being rare or absent in others. This was not the kind of variation that could be explained simply by distance or isolation. The structure of these segments suggested that they had entered the human genome from a source that followed a slightly different evolutionary path. The difference was not large enough to create a separate identity within the body, but it was stable enough to be traced. Over time, this pattern was studied more carefully, using increasingly precise methods. What emerged was a picture of inheritance that did not follow a single, uninterrupted line. Instead, there were moments where the genetic path seemed to widen, incorporating material that did not originate entirely within the known range of Homo sapiens variation. These moments were not frequent in a way that would dominate the genome, but they were not random either. They appeared as consistent signals, repeated across individuals who shared certain ancestral connections. This consistency is important because it moves the observation beyond uncertainty. Random changes in DNA occur regularly, but they do not tend to produce the same structured pattern across different populations. The segments in question showed a coherence that suggested a shared origin. This led to a more careful comparison with the genetic material extracted from ancient human remains, including those associated with groups like the Denisovans. The comparison did not produce a perfect match, but it revealed a level of similarity that could not be easily dismissed. Certain segments in modern human DNA aligned more closely with Denisovan sequences than with those typical of Homo sapiens alone. This does not mean that entire sections of the body come from a different group. The integration is far more subtle than that. These are small portions of the genome, carried across many generations, gradually blending into the broader structure. But their presence is enough to indicate that there were points in the past where genetic exchange occurred. If we return to the broader context of human origins, this becomes a natural extension of what we have already considered. Different human groups existed at the same time, in overlapping regions. Their interactions were not always continuous, and the details remain partly uncertain. But even limited contact, over long periods of time, can lead to exchange that leaves lasting traces. These traces are not visible in the way we usually perceive identity. They do not create a sense of division within the individual. Instead, they become part of a shared biological system, integrated so completely that their origins are no longer apparent without careful analysis. Bringing this back to the present, it becomes possible to see the body as carrying a record that is both continuous and composite. Continuous in the sense that it has been passed down through generations without interruption. Composite in the sense that it includes elements that originated in different contexts, shaped by different environments, and then brought together through processes that are no longer directly visible. This does not change the way the body functions in any obvious way from one moment to the next, but it does change how we understand its history. The presence of these genetic segments suggests that the body is not only the result of a single, isolated development. It reflects a history of interaction where different human groups contributed in ways that are still detectable, even after those groups have disappeared as distinct populations. This understanding remains careful and grounded in what can be observed. It does not require assumptions beyond the available evidence. The patterns in DNA can be measured, compared, and traced with increasing clarity, and through that process, they point toward a past where the boundaries between human groups were not completely closed, allowing for connections that continue to be carried forward quietly within the structure of the modern human body. As these patterns were studied over time, a quieter realization began to take shape. The presence of these segments was not an isolated detail, but part of a broader structure within the human genome. They were not evenly distributed, and they did not appear in the same way across all populations. Instead, they followed patterns that reflected movement, environment, and ancestry over long periods of time. In some regions, these segments were more common, suggesting that the interactions which introduced them occurred in specific places and under particular conditions. In other regions, they were rare or absent, indicating that the pathways of human movement did not carry those influences everywhere in the same way. This uneven distribution adds another layer to the idea of continuity. The body is not only shaped by what has been carried forward, but also by where those elements have been carried. Geography becomes part of the story, not as a fixed boundary, but as a pathway through which different influences moved and settled. If we return again to the deeper past, toward the time when multiple human groups existed at once, this begins to align with what we would expect from a world shaped by movement and variation. Groups did not remain completely isolated, but they did not mix uniformly either. Their interactions were shaped by distance, by terrain, and by the gradual pace of migration. This means that the genetic exchanges that occurred were also uneven, leaving traces that are more visible in some populations than in others. These traces do not remain separate over time. They become integrated into the broader genetic structure, passed down through generations, gradually blending into the overall pattern. But even as they blend, they retain enough of their original structure to be identified when examined closely. This creates a situation where the body carries elements from different sources without presenting them as distinct parts. Everything appears unified, and in everyday experience, it functions that way. Yet within that unity, there are layers that reflect different points in the past. Bringing this back to the present, the body becomes less like a single narrative and more like a record with multiple threads. The way your body responds to certain environmental conditions may be influenced by genetic segments that entered the human population under very different circumstances. These influences are not something you can feel directly as separate from yourself. They do not create a sense of difference in the way we usually think about identity. Instead, they exist as part of the underlying system, contributing quietly to how the body functions. This does not suggest that the body is divided or inconsistent. It suggests that it is cumulative, built from a history that includes both continuity and interaction. The segments that can be traced to other human groups do not stand apart from the rest of the genome. They are part of it, integrated into the same system that supports all other biological processes. But their presence still points toward a past where the boundaries between human groups were not completely closed. Over time, those boundaries became less visible, not because they never existed, but because their effects were absorbed into a larger whole. This absorption does not erase the past. It transforms it into something less visible but still present. If we consider this carefully, the idea introduced at the beginning becomes more grounded. The body may carry influences from groups that are no longer present in the world as distinct populations, not in a way that separates them from the rest of human identity, but in a way that reflects a shared history shaped by coexistence and exchange. These influences are not dramatic, and they do not define the body in isolation, but they are part of its structure. part of the quiet continuity that connects the present to a past where the human story was more complex than a single uninterrupted line. And if those influences remain, even in small and subtle ways, then the body becomes not only a reflection of where we come from, but also a continuation of connections that once existed between different forms of human life, now carried forward without clear boundaries, yet still present within the system as it exists today. If these genetic segments were only silent traces, carried forward without any effect, they might remain as a detail that belongs only to the study of the past. But what makes them more difficult to set aside is that they are not entirely inactive. They are part of the same system that continues to operate in your body at this very moment. This does not mean that they control how the body works, or that they create clear, separate functions that can be easily identified. Their influence is much more subtle than that. It is woven into processes that are already ongoing, contributing in ways that are not immediately visible but can still be observed when studied carefully. The body does not divide its functions according to origin. It does not treat one part as older and another as newer. Everything works together as a unified system. But within that unity, certain genetic sequences play roles that can affect how the body responds to its environment. Some of these roles are connected to how the body manages oxygen, how it regulates temperature, or how it reacts to external stress. These are not abstract ideas. They are part of the everyday functioning of the body, even if they do not draw attention to themselves. If we move back toward the deeper origins of these processes, it becomes clearer that they were shaped under conditions that differ from those most people experience today. Environments with lower oxygen levels, colder climates, or different ecological pressures required adjustments that were not temporary. Over long periods of time, these adjustments became embedded in the structure of the body, carried forward through generations because they allowed survival under those specific conditions. When different human groups, each shaped by their own environments, came into contact, the exchange of genetic material could include these adaptations. This means that certain responses present in the modern body may reflect conditions that were not part of a single lineage, but were developed in different contexts and then combined. If we return to the present, this creates a situation where the body may respond to certain environments in ways that are influenced by this layered history. For example, the way the body adjusts to reduced oxygen levels at high altitude can vary between populations, reflecting long-term adaptation to those conditions. In some cases, genetic sequences associated with Denisovan ancestry have been linked to these kinds of adaptations. This does not imply that the adaptation belongs entirely to one group or that it can be reduced to a single source. It suggests that the exchange of genetic material may have contributed to the ability of certain populations to live in environments that would otherwise be more difficult to endure. This kind of influence is not something that can be felt directly. You do not notice a specific part of your body responding because of its origin. Instead, you experience the result as part of a continuous system. The body adjusts, compensates, and maintains stability without separating the contributions that make those adjustments possible. This is why the presence of these genetic segments can go unnoticed in everyday life. They do not create clear boundaries or distinct sensations. They are part of the background of how the body works. If we consider this carefully, the idea that the body carries forward influences from groups that no longer exist becomes less abstract. It is not only about the presence of genetic material, but about the possibility that some of that material still plays a role in how the body functions. Not in a way that defines the individual or creates a separate identity, but in a way that contributes to the overall system, shaped by conditions that existed long before the present moment. This does not require assuming that every adaptation can be traced back with certainty. The evidence must be interpreted carefully, and not every connection is fully understood. But where patterns can be observed and compared, they suggest that the body is not only a record of past interactions, but also a continuation of functional influences that remain active, even if their origins are no longer visible in the world around us. If these influences remain active, they do not appear as separate functions that can be easily isolated. They are not felt as something added onto the body from the outside. Instead, they are part of how the body maintains balance in changing conditions. This balance is not fixed. It is a constant adjustment, a quiet process of responding to small shifts in the environment. The body regulates temperature, manages energy, and adjusts breathing without requiring conscious attention. These processes feel stable, but they are the result of systems that are always responding to variation. If we move back again toward the deeper origins of these systems, it becomes clear that they were not formed under the stable conditions that many people experience today. Early human environments were often unpredictable. Food availability changed, temperatures shifted, and landscapes could transform over long periods of time. In such conditions, the body did not develop a single solution. It developed flexibility, the ability to respond in multiple ways depending on what was required at a given moment. Over time, this flexibility became part of the body's structure, carried forward because it allowed survival across a range of environments. When different human groups encountered one another, each carrying their own adaptations, the possibility of exchange meant that some of these responses could be combined. This combination does not create a perfect system. It creates a system that is capable of functioning across different conditions, even if those conditions are no longer present in the same way. If we return to the present, this can be observed in the way different populations respond to similar environments. The ability to tolerate high altitude, for example, varies across groups, reflecting long-term adaptation to regions where oxygen levels are lower. In some cases, genetic sequences associated with Denisovan ancestry have been linked to these differences. This does not suggest a simple cause and effect. It does not mean that a single genetic segment determines the outcome. The body's response to altitude involves many interacting systems, and the contribution of any one part must be understood within that larger context. But the association is strong enough to suggest that past interactions between human groups may have played a role in shaping how these systems function today. This kind of influence extends beyond a single example. The way the body responds to environmental stress, to temperature changes, or to variations in available resources may also reflect this layered history. These responses are not separate from the individual. They are experienced as part of the body's normal functioning, but their origins may lie in conditions that are no longer directly experienced. This creates a quiet continuity between the past and the present. The body does not reset itself when environments change. It carries forward what has worked, even if the original context has shifted. This continuity does not produce a perfect alignment with the modern world. There can be small mismatches, moments where the body's responses feel slightly out of place, but these are not necessarily errors. They are the result of a system that was shaped to handle variation, not to fit a single unchanging environment. If we consider this carefully, the presence of Denisovan genetic influences becomes part of a broader pattern. It is not an isolated detail, but one example of how the body carries forward adaptations that were shaped under different conditions. These adaptations do not remain separate or identifiable in everyday experience. They are integrated into the overall system, contributing to how the body maintains balance across a range of situations. This does not mean that every response can be traced back with certainty. Many aspects of the body's functioning are influenced by multiple factors, and the connections are not always clear, but where patterns can be observed, they suggest that the body is not only shaped by a single line of development, it is shaped by interactions, by exchanges, and by the gradual accumulation of responses that have been carried forward across time. And within that accumulation, the influence of groups that are no longer present may still be active, not as a separate identity, but as part of the quiet process through which the body continues to function in the present. If we follow this line of thought to its quiet conclusion, the role of these genetic influences becomes less about specific traits and more about how the body maintains continuity across changing conditions. The body does not operate by isolating one adaptation from another. It functions as a network, where many small processes interact to create a stable response. Within that network, certain genetic sequences may contribute in ways that are difficult to separate, but still meaningful. They do not act alone, and they do not define the outcome by themselves. Instead, they become part of a larger pattern, influencing how the system adjusts under different circumstances. If we move back once more toward the deeper origins of these patterns, we return to a world where survival depended on responding to environments that were not stable or predictable. Human groups adapted over long periods of time not by finding a single solution, but by developing systems that could operate across a range of conditions. These systems were shaped gradually, through repeated exposure to environmental pressures. When different groups encountered one another, The exchange of genetic material could include parts of these systems. Over time, those parts became integrated, carried forward without remaining separate. This integration does not preserve a clear boundary between what came from one group and what came from another. The body does not maintain a record in that form. It maintains a functional system, where the origins of each component are no longer visible in isolation, but the effects can still be observed in how the body responds. The ability to adjust to variations in oxygen, to regulate temperature, or to respond to environmental stress reflects a system that has been shaped by multiple influences. Some of those influences may trace back to groups like the Denisovans, whose adaptations were developed under conditions that differ from those most people experience today. If we return again to the present, this creates a subtle shift in how the body can be understood. It is not simply a structure built for the current environment. It is a structure that carries forward solutions from past environments, even when those environments are no longer present. This does not mean that every aspect of the body is perfectly suited to the modern world. In some cases, the responses that once supported survival may no longer align completely with current conditions, but they remain, because they are part of a system that values continuity over replacement. This continuity is not static. It changes slowly, across many generations, shaped by new conditions and new pressures, but it does not erase what came before. It builds on it, layer by layer, integrating older responses into newer contexts. Within this process, the influence of Denisovan genetic material becomes one example of how the body carries forward contributions from groups that are no longer present as distinct populations. These contributions do not stand out in everyday experience. They are not something that can be felt directly or identified without careful study, but they are part of the system, part of the way the body continues to function. This does not require assuming that every function has a clear and direct origin. Many aspects of the body's behavior are the result of complex interactions shaped by multiple factors over time. But where connections can be observed, they suggest that the body is not only a reflection of a single evolutionary path. It is the result of a history that includes interaction, exchange, and gradual integration. If we consider this carefully, the idea that the body still carries traces of a species that has disappeared becomes less abstract. It is not about preserving a separate identity within the body. It is about the continuation of functional influences that have been integrated so completely that they feel like a natural part of how the body works. And if those influences remain, even in small and subtle ways, then the body becomes a place where the past is not only remembered, but still quietly active, shaping responses that continue to unfold in the present without drawing attention to their origins. There are moments when the body encounters a condition that feels slightly more difficult than expected. The air becomes thinner, the temperature drops, or the environment shifts in a way that requires adjustment. At first, these changes may seem minor. The body responds, breathing a little faster, conserving heat, adjusting its balance without drawing much attention. But if the condition continues, the difference becomes more noticeable. The body begins to work harder, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, sustained effort to maintain stability. This response can feel natural, as if it is simply how the body is designed to function. But when we look more closely, it becomes clear that not all bodies respond in exactly the same way. Some adjust more easily, others require more time, and some struggle more under the same conditions. This variation is not random. It reflects a deeper history of adaptation, shaped by environments that differ from one place to another. If we move back toward the origins of these differences, we find that they were not formed in a single setting. Human populations spread across regions that require different kinds of responses. In high-altitude areas where oxygen levels are lower, the body had to develop ways to manage reduced oxygen availability. This is not a simple adjustment. It involves multiple systems working together, including breathing, circulation, and the way oxygen is used at the cellular level. Over long periods of time, certain populations developed patterns that allowed them to live in these conditions more effectively. These patterns were not temporary. They became part of how the body functioned, carried forward across generations because they supported survival in those environments. When we return to the present, these differences can still be observed. Some populations are able to live at high altitudes with fewer signs of stress, while others experience greater difficulty. This does not mean that one body is better than another. It reflects the conditions under which those bodies were shaped. In some cases, genetic sequences associated with Denisovan ancestry have been linked to these kinds of adaptations, particularly in populations that have lived for long periods at high altitude. This does not suggest a simple origin for the adaptation. The body's response to altitude is complex, involving many interacting factors, but the presence of these genetic influences indicates that past interactions between human groups may have contributed to how certain populations manage these conditions today. If we consider this carefully, the idea of adaptation becomes less about individual experience and more about continuity across time. The body you live in now may carry responses that were shaped in environments you have never encountered. These responses are not memories in the usual sense. They do not appear as something you can recall or recognize. They exist as part of how the body functions, quietly influencing how it adjusts to changes in the environment. This creates a subtle connection between the present and the past. The body does not begin from a neutral state with each generation. It carries forward what has worked, integrating past adaptations into its current structure. In environments that resemble those earlier conditions, these adaptations may align well with the present. In environments that differ, the alignment may be less complete, requiring the body to adjust in ways that feel more demanding. This does not suggest that the body is misaligned in a simple way. It reflects the fact that the body is shaped by a range of conditions, not a single one. The influence of Denisovan genetic material in this context becomes one example of how different histories can contribute to the way the body responds. It is not a separate system, and it does not operate independently. It is part of a larger network of processes that work together to maintain balance. But its presence points toward a past where adaptation was not confined to a single group. It was shared, exchanged, and carried forward, leaving traces that continue to shape how the body interacts with the world, even in conditions that are far removed from those in which those adaptations first emerged. If we remain with this idea of variation for a little longer, the differences begin to feel less like exceptions and more like a quiet pattern that extends across many environments. High altitude is one of the clearer examples, but it is not the only one. Temperature, humidity, and even the way the body manages energy across changing conditions can all reveal small differences in how people respond. These differences are often subtle. They do not divide people into clear categories, and they do not create visible boundaries in everyday life. But when observed carefully, especially across generations and regions, they begin to show a consistency that reflects long-term adaptation. If we move back again toward the earlier stages of human development, these patterns begin to align with the environments in which different populations lived. Groups that spent long periods in colder climates developed ways of maintaining body heat more effectively. This did not involve a single change, but a combination of responses, including how the body stores and uses energy, how blood flows near the surface of the skin, and how heat is retained during periods of rest. In warmer environments, the challenges were different, and the body adapted in ways that supported cooling and energy balance under those conditions. These adaptations did not appear suddenly. They emerged gradually, shaped by repeated exposure to the same pressures over many generations. When different groups encountered one another, the possibility of exchange meant that some of these responses could be shared. Not all of them, and not in a complete way, but enough to become part of the broader human variation that we see today. If we return once more to the present, this creates a situation where the body may carry responses that reflect a wider range of environments than those it currently experiences. A person living in a moderate climate may still carry adaptations that were shaped in colder or more variable conditions. These adaptations do not always have a clear function in the present, but they remain part of the system because they have been carried forward over time. In some cases, genetic sequences associated with Denisovan ancestry have been linked not only to altitude adaptation, but also to aspects of how the body responds to environmental stress more broadly. These connections are still being studied carefully, and not all of them are fully understood. It is important to approach them with caution, recognizing that the body's responses are shaped by many interacting factors. But where patterns can be observed, they suggest that the influence of past interactions between human groups extends beyond a single type of adaptation. This does not mean that these influences are always beneficial in the present. The body was shaped under conditions that are not identical to those most people experience today. As a result, some responses may feel slightly out of place or may require adjustment when the environment changes. This is not a sign of failure. It is a reflection of the body's continuity, its tendency to carry forward what has worked, even when the context has shifted. If we consider this carefully, the body becomes less like a system designed for a specific set of conditions and more like a system prepared for variation. It holds onto a range of possible responses, some of which may be more active in certain environments than others. Within this range, the influence of Denisovan genetic material can be seen as one part of a larger pattern. It is not the only source of adaptation, and it does not act in isolation, but it contributes to the diversity of responses that the body can draw upon when conditions change. This diversity does not always reveal itself clearly. It remains in the background, shaping how the body responds without separating those responses into distinct origins. And yet, it reflects a history in which human adaptation was not confined to a single path, but was shaped by multiple groups, multiple environments, and moments of interaction that continue to influence how the body functions, even in a world that no longer resembles the one in which those adaptations first emerged. If we follow these variations to their quieter edge, they begin to feel less like distinct traits and more like a range of possibilities held within the same body. The body does not switch from one mode to another in a clear or visible way. It adjusts gradually, drawing on responses that are already present within its structure. Some of these responses become more active under certain conditions, while others remain in the background, less visible but still part of the system. This is how the body maintains continuity across environments that are never exactly the same. It does not rely on a single solution. It carries a set of potential responses, shaped over time, that can be expressed when needed. If we move back again toward the deeper origins of these patterns, the idea of adaptation becomes less fixed. It is not a final state that the body reaches and then holds unchanged. It is an ongoing process, shaped by repeated exposure to conditions that require adjustment. Human groups that lived in different regions did not arrive at identical solutions. They developed responses that were suited to their specific environments, and these responses became part of their biological structure. When groups encountered one another, even in limited ways, the possibility of exchange meant that some of these responses could be combined. Over time, these combined influences became part of the broader human variation, carried forward across generations. If we return once more to the present, the body can be understood as holding this range of possibilities within a single system. The way it responds to temperature, to oxygen levels, or to environmental stress reflects not only the conditions it is currently experiencing, but also the conditions under which its patterns were formed. These patterns are not separate from one another. They interact, overlap, and adjust as part of a unified process. In this context, the influence of Denisovan genetic material becomes one thread within a larger fabric. It does not stand apart from the rest of the system, and it does not define the body in isolation. But it contributes to the range of responses that the body can draw upon, especially in environments that resemble those in which those adaptations first developed. This contribution is not always visible, and it is not always active in the same way across all individuals or populations. It depends on how the body's systems interact with current conditions. In some cases, the influence may align closely with the environment, making certain adjustments more efficient. In other cases, it may remain less active, present but not prominently expressed. This variability does not indicate inconsistency. It reflects the fact that the body is not designed for a single fixed world. It is designed to carry forward a range of responses that can be used under different circumstances. If we consider this carefully, the idea that the body still remembers a species that has disappeared begins to take on a more precise meaning. It is not a memory in the sense of recalling an image or an event. It is a continuity of function, a persistence of patterns that were shaped in a different time and then carried forward into the present. These patterns do not reveal themselves as something separate or unfamiliar. They are experienced as part of the body's normal behavior, even when their origins are not immediately clear. This creates a quiet connection between the present and a past that is no longer directly visible. The body continues to respond, to adjust, and to maintain balance using systems that were formed across different environments and at times across different human groups. And within this ongoing process, the traces of those groups remain, not as a distinct presence, but as part of the subtle range of possibilities that the body continues to hold and express. Even in a world that has moved far beyond the conditions in which those patterns first emerged, the body does not only adjust to mountains, cold air, or changing landscapes, it also lives in constant contact with something less visible and often more immediate, the biological world around it. Every day, without your awareness, the body meets bacteria, viruses, parasites, and countless foreign substances. Most of the time, this happens quietly. You do not feel the body identifying what belongs and what does not. You do not notice the layers of response that begin before thought, before language, before any conscious decision. And yet these responses are among the oldest and most important systems the body carries. They are part of survival at its most basic level. If we move back toward the deeper beginnings of human life, this becomes easier to understand. Early humans did not live in sealed environments. They moved through open landscapes, drank from uncertain water sources, ate food that could not be fully controlled, and encountered pathogens that varied from place to place. Survival did not depend only on strength or shelter. It also depended on how the body could recognize danger at the smallest scale and respond without collapsing under the pressure of infection. Over many generations, this constant contact with the biological environment shaped the immune system, not as a perfect barrier, but as a flexible and highly reactive network. Different human groups, living in different places for long periods of time, would have faced different biological pressures. The pathogens present in one environment were not always the same as those in another. This means that the immune systems of different groups were likely shaped by somewhat different conditions, gradually adjusting to the specific microbial worlds around them. If we connect this to the larger history we have been following, a new possibility appears. When different human groups encountered one another, the exchange between them may not only have involved traits related to climate or altitude, it may also have involved genetic variants connected to immune response. This idea matters because the immune system is not a minor feature of the body. It is one of the main ways the body remains alive in a world filled with constant biological contact. If certain genetic influences from Denisovan-related populations entered modern human populations, some of those influences may have affected how the immune system functions. This does not mean that one group had a complete answer to disease or that inherited variants always produced better outcomes in every setting. The immune system is extremely complex, and its behavior depends on many genes interacting together, as well as on environment, nutrition, age, and chance. But careful research has suggested that some archaic human DNA, including Denisovan-related DNA in some populations, may be associated with immune-related functions. This must be stated carefully. Not every connection is fully understood, and not every inherited segment has a clear effect that can be seen in ordinary life. Still, the broader pattern is consistent with something important. The body may carry forward immune responses that were shaped not only within Homo sapiens alone, but also through contact with other human groups who had already been living in certain environments for very long periods. If we return to the present, this creates a quiet shift in how the body can be understood. The immune system feels entirely modern because it is operating in you now, in this moment, responding to the world you are in. But some of the deeper patterns within it may come from a much older landscape of interaction, migration, and exposure. The body does not label these patterns by origin. It does not tell you which response was shaped in one place and which in another. It simply uses what it has inherited. In that sense, the body is less like a new design and more like an accumulated system, holding on to variations that once helped people remain alive under very different biological conditions. This does not mean the immune system is always well matched to the present. A response that once offered protection in one environment may behave differently in another. What mattered in the past was not perfection, but persistence. The body carried forward what worked well enough to continue. And if some of those inherited patterns came through contact with Denisovan-related populations, then the body may still be using fragments of that older biological experience today, not as a memory you can feel directly, but as part of the quiet way it distinguishes threat from safety, self from non-self, and survival from loss. If we look more closely at how the immune system behaves, it becomes clear that it is not a fixed barrier, but a system that is constantly learning, adjusting, and balancing its responses. It must recognize what belongs to the body and what does not, and it must do so quickly, often before any conscious awareness. This process is not simple. It involves a wide network of signals, cells, and molecular patterns that interact in ways that are still being studied. What matters here is that small differences in genetic structure can influence how this system responds, sometimes in ways that are difficult to notice without careful observation. If we move back toward the earlier stages of human development, this complexity becomes easier to understand. Different human groups, living in different environments, would have encountered different combinations of pathogens. Over time, their immune systems would have adapted, not by becoming universally stronger, but by becoming more suited to the specific biological conditions they faced. These adaptations were not isolated traits. They were part of a broader system, shaped gradually through repeated exposure and survival across generations. When different groups encountered one another, the possibility of genetic exchange meant that some of these immune-related variations could be shared. This does not imply a simple transfer of protection from one group to another. The immune system does not operate in that way. It is influenced by many factors, and any inherited variation becomes part of a larger network that determines how the body responds. But the presence of certain genetic segments, linked through careful analysis to archaic human populations, suggests that some of these variations may have contributed to how the immune system functions in modern humans. These contributions are not always visible in everyday experience. You do not feel the genetic origin of your immune response when your body reacts to an infection or a foreign substance. The response feels immediate and unified. But beneath that unity, there may be layers shaped by different points in the past, including interactions with groups that are no longer present as distinct populations. This idea must be approached with care. Not every immune-related variation can be traced back to a specific source, and not every connection is fully understood. Scientific understanding in this area continues to develop, and conclusions are drawn based on patterns that can be measured and compared. Still, the broader pattern is consistent with what we have already seen in other systems of the body. The immune system, like the systems that regulate temperature or oxygen use, may carry forward influences from a history that includes multiple human groups. If we return to the present, this creates a subtle shift in how the body's responses can be understood. The way your body reacts to certain environmental exposures, to unfamiliar substances, or to changes in its internal balance may not be shaped entirely by recent history. It may also reflect deeper layers of adaptation, formed under conditions that are no longer directly experienced. These layers do not act independently. They are integrated into the overall system, contributing to responses that appear unified, even if their origins are more complex. This integration does not always produce perfect alignment with the present. In some cases, the immune system may respond more strongly or less predictably than expected, reflecting the fact that it was shaped under different conditions. These responses are not necessarily errors. They are part of a system that has been built over time, carrying forward what has supported survival, even as environments have changed. If we consider this carefully, the presence of Denisovan-related genetic influences within the immune system becomes one example of how the body maintains continuity across different biological worlds. It does not separate the past from the present. It carries them together, allowing responses shaped in one context to continue functioning in another. And within that continuity, the body may still be using patterns that originated in encounters between human groups long ago, patterns that have been integrated so completely that they feel like a natural part of how the body responds today. If we follow this line of thought to its quieter edge, the immune system begins to look less like a modern defense built only for the world around you now, and more like an older inheritance still working beneath your awareness. It is one of the most intimate examples of how the body carries history forward without showing it openly. You do not feel your immune system remembering anything. You only feel the outcome when the body reacts, resists, or struggles to regain balance. Yet the system itself is built from layers of response that were shaped over very long periods of time. If we move back toward the origins of our species, and toward the wider human world that existed beside it, this becomes easier to understand. Early human groups did not face the same biological pressures everywhere they lived. Different landscapes carried different pathogens, different parasites, and different combinations of environmental stress. A group living for many generations in one region would not meet exactly the same biological world as a group living far away under different ecological conditions. Over time, these differences mattered. They shaped the immune system not into a perfect shield, but into a flexible pattern of recognition and response. When human groups that had lived apart for long periods came into contact, the exchange between them may have included not only traits related to climate or oxygen, but also variants that affected how the body managed biological threat. This possibility matters because the immune system is never passive. It is always sorting, comparing, allowing, rejecting. It must remain active without becoming destructive. It must react strongly enough to protect the body, but not so strongly that it harms the body it is meant to defend. This balance is delicate, and small inherited differences can shape how it is maintained. In that sense, immune-related Denisovan influences do not need to act as dramatic or visible changes to matter. Their role may be quiet, built into the background of how responses are tuned, how signals are interpreted, or how strongly certain reactions unfold. We should be careful here, because the evidence does not support turning every immune response into a story about a single archaic source. The immune system is too complex for that. Many genes are involved, and their effects depend on environment, nutrition, age, and many other factors. But the larger pattern remains meaningful. Some Denisovan-related genetic traces in modern populations have been linked in research to immune-related biology, and that is enough to support a careful conclusion. Contact between human groups may have influenced not only how the body adapted to cold or altitude, but also how it recognized and managed biological danger. If we return to the present, this creates a quiet shift in perspective. The body you live in each day may still be using responses shaped partly by environments you have never seen and by human groups you will never meet, because they are gone as separate populations. Those responses no longer belong to them alone. They have been carried into a different body, a different time, a different world. But they have not vanished. They remain inside the larger system, functioning without explanation, integrated so completely that they feel natural. This is perhaps one of the clearest ways the past continues without announcing itself. Not through visible memory, not through conscious knowledge, but through a living mechanism that still distinguishes between what should be allowed and what must be resisted. The body does not know that it is carrying a layered history. It simply continues. It protects, adjusts, and reacts, using what has been passed forward. And because of that, disappearance becomes a less complete idea than it first seems. A human group can vanish from the visible world and still remain, very faintly, in the reactions of another body many thousands of years later. Not as a ghost, not as a hidden person inside you, but as a contribution absorbed into the deeper logic of survival. In this way, the immune system becomes one more place where the body may still be holding on to traces of an older human world, using them quietly in the present, even though the conditions that shaped them and the people who first carried them are now far beyond ordinary memory. It is comforting to imagine that human history moved in a clean and simple direction, as if one form of human slowly replaced another until only one remained. That picture feels orderly. It gives the impression that the body you live in today came from a single path, refined over time, with each stage leaving the previous one fully behind. But the deeper record does not remain that tidy. The more carefully the past is examined, the harder it becomes to hold on to the idea of a fully separate and uninterrupted line. What begins to appear instead is a history of overlap. Different human groups did not always live in isolation from one another, and they did not always disappear before another arrived. For long stretches of time, more than one kind of human existed on the earth at once, moving through neighboring landscapes, adapting to different conditions, and in some cases coming close enough that the boundary between them was not absolute. If we return to the origins of our own species, this matters immediately. Homo sapiens did not emerge into a world that was empty of other human forms. The world already contained populations shaped by older migrations and longer residence in particular regions. Some had adapted to cold, some to altitude, some to environmental pressures that remain only partly visible to us now. As Homo sapiens spread into new areas, those earlier groups did not simply vanish on contact in every case. The evidence suggests something more layered than simple replacement. There were encounters, and some of those encounters left traces that could continue beyond the disappearance of a group as a separate population. This changes the meaning of ancestry in a quiet but important way. It suggests that modern humans are not best understood as the outcome of a single pure line moving forward untouched. They are better understood as the result of a long process in which lines sometimes separated, sometimes ran in parallel, and sometimes crossed. The crossing does not erase the differences that once existed. It means those differences did not remain sealed off forever. They could enter the larger human story and become part of what was carried forward. If we bring this back to the body, the effect is subtle but profound. The body feels singular, it feels complete, unified, and present. You do not experience it as a mixture of histories, you experience it as yourself. But beneath that immediate feeling, the body may include inherited contributions from groups that no longer exist in their older form. These contributions are not arranged in visible layers, and they do not create separate identities inside the body. They are integrated into the same system that regulates breathing, temperature, immunity, and response to stress. That is why the older idea of human purity becomes difficult to maintain. Purity suggests sealed boundaries, uninterrupted inheritance, and a past where contact did not alter the line. But the evidence from ancient DNA points towards something more fluid, not completely mixed, not without distinction, but not sealed either. Some human groups remained separate for long periods, and that separation mattered. Yet separation was not always permanent. Where boundaries opened, even briefly, something could pass through and remain. If we return once more to the deep past, this makes the Denisovan story easier to place within the larger pattern. Denisovans were not an isolated curiosity standing outside human history. They were one part of a broader human world in which related groups existed at the same time and, under some conditions, exchanged genetic material. Their traces in modern humans are meaningful not only because they tell us something about one lost population, but because they show that the human story itself was never as linear as it once seemed. The body, in that sense, is not a final product of perfect replacement. It is the result of survival through contact, movement, and gradual integration. This does not reduce modern humans to fragments of older groups, nor does it erase the distinct path of Homo sapiens. It means only that our path was not walked alone and was not protected from every crossing. If we consider this slowly, the feeling is slightly unsettling in a quiet way. The body that feels wholly your own may come from a history that was never wholly singular. The human form that seems complete in the present may carry the continuation of populations that disappeared as visible groups but did not disappear without leaving anything behind. And if that is true, then the body is not evidence of a pure line reaching the present untouched. It is evidence that the human past was more open, more entangled, and more biologically connected than the simpler story ever allowed. When people imagine the past, they often imagine separation first. One group here, another group there, each following its own path until one survives and the others fade away. That image is simple, and for a long time it shaped the way many people understood human origins. It suggests clean boundaries, as if different human groups could be arranged side by side without much contact, each one distinct and self-contained. But the deeper record does not remain that still. The more evidence is gathered from genetics, fossils, and migration patterns, the more the older image begins to soften. The boundaries were real, but they were not always closed. Different human groups could remain distinct for long periods and still come into contact from time to time. That contact did not need to be frequent to matter. Even limited exchange spread across generations could leave traces that continued long after the original meeting was over. If we move back toward the earliest expansions of Homo sapiens, this becomes easier to understand. Movement across the earth did not happen all at once, and it did not happen across empty ground. It happened gradually, through landscapes already occupied by other human populations with their own histories and adaptations. Some of those groups had lived in certain regions for very long periods, adjusting slowly to local conditions in ways Homo sapiens had not yet experienced. When newer populations entered those regions, the encounter was not automatically a complete barrier or a complete merger. The outcome could vary. In some places, groups may have remained separate. In others, they may have overlapped only briefly. and in some cases there is enough evidence to suggest that contact included biological exchange. This is where the idea of a pure human line begins to weaken. Purity assumes that inheritance moved forward without interruption from only one source, as if the body of the present can be traced through a path untouched by neighboring groups. But ancient DNA does not fully support that image. Instead, it shows that some modern human populations carry inherited material from older human groups that no longer exist as distinct peoples. These inherited traces are not large enough to turn the body into something divided. They do not interrupt the unity of the human form, but they do show that the path forward was more open than the older model allowed. If we return to the present, this changes the feeling of the body in a subtle way. The body still feels singular, still feels complete. You do not wake each day with the sense that you are carrying multiple histories within you. Yet biologically, the body may contain exactly that. Not separate selves, not hidden identities, but layered inheritances that have been absorbed into one functioning whole. The body does not preserve the past as a visible archive. It preserves it through continuities of structure and response. Some of those continuities may come from earlier human groups whose identities disappeared as distinct populations, while parts of their biology continued inside other lineages. This does not mean that all human groups mixed freely or that distinctions did not matter. Distinctions did matter. Long periods of separation shaped real differences, but separation and contact are not opposites that cancel each other out. They can both be true in the same long history. Groups can remain distinct for thousands of years and still leave something behind in one another when circumstances allow contact. That is why the human story is harder to describe as a straight line than it first appears. It is closer to a set of paths that sometimes ran apart and sometimes crossed, with consequences that did not always disappear when the groups themselves became less visible. If we move once more toward the deeper beginnings of this video's central question, the Denisovan example becomes part of a much larger pattern. Their traces matter not only because they reveal one lost population, but because they help show that the body of modern humans was shaped in a world where human existence was more plural than singular. More than one human group lived, adapted, and endured at the same time. Some vanished in form, some continued more directly, and some, like the Denisovans, may have passed part of themselves forward into bodies that would one day belong to people living in a completely different world. If we sit with that slowly, the meaning of being human becomes slightly less fixed than it first seems. The body is not evidence that one line won and all others left nothing behind. It is evidence that survival sometimes included contact, exchange, and quiet biological continuation. And that means the body you live in now may not stand at the end of a sealed human story, but inside one that remained open longer than we once believed. If we follow this idea carefully, the meaning of human begins to shift in a very quiet way, not into something uncertain or unstable, but into something less rigid than it first appears. It is easy to think of the human body as the end point of a process, a finished form that stands apart from what came before. That idea feels complete, as if the present has separated itself from the past. But the deeper we look, the more it becomes clear that the body is not a final version. It is a continuation, shaped by processes that did not always move in a single direction and did not always remain separate. This does not make the body less human. It makes the idea of what human means more layered than a single uninterrupted line. If we move back once more toward the earliest stages of our species, the pattern becomes easier to see. Different human groups shared the same world for long periods. They adapted to different conditions, followed different paths, and remained distinct in ways that mattered. But those distinctions did not always remain sealed. There were moments where the boundary softened, where contact allowed something to pass through. That passage did not preserve the older group as it once was. It transformed it into something quieter, something that could be carried forward without remaining visible. Over time, those contributions became part of the larger system, integrated into bodies that would continue long after the original groups disappeared as separate populations. If we return to the present, this integration is no longer visible in a direct way. The body does not show its layers openly. It does not divide itself into parts that can be traced back to different groups without careful study. Instead, it presents itself as a unified form, stable and continuous. But within that unity, there may still be traces of those earlier crossings, preserved not as identities but as functions. The way the body responds to its environment, the way it maintains balance, the way it adapts under pressure, these may all reflect a history that includes more than one source. This does not mean that the body is incomplete or divided. It means that it is cumulative. It carries forward what has been integrated over time, even when the original context is no longer visible. The idea of purity becomes less useful in this context, not because it was entirely wrong, but because it does not capture the full complexity of what happened. Human history included separation, but it also included moments where separation gave way to contact. Those moments were not constant, and they were not uniform across all populations, but they were enough to leave traces that persist. If we consider this carefully, the body becomes something more than a single narrative reaching the present. It becomes a place where multiple histories have been absorbed into one continuous form. The Denisovan example is one of the clearest ways to see this, but it is not the only one. It stands as a reminder that disappearance does not always mean complete absence. A group can vanish as a visible population and still remain, in a very subtle way, within the biology of others. This does not turn the body into a collection of separate parts. It keeps it as a unified system, but one that has been shaped by interactions that are no longer visible in everyday life. And if we allow this idea to settle slowly, it changes the way the present connects to the past. The body you live in is not only the result of a single path moving forward without interruption, it is the result of paths that sometimes crossed, sometimes merged, and then continued together without showing where the crossing took place. That crossing is no longer visible in the way we usually think of history, but it may still be present in the way the body functions. And in that sense, being human is not only about belonging to one uninterrupted line, it is also about carrying forward the quiet outcome of a past that was more connected, more open, and more layered than it first appears, even if those layers are no longer visible on the surface. If the body were only a product of the present, it would make immediate sense in the world around you. Its responses would feel perfectly matched to modern conditions, and its deeper patterns would not carry the weight of environments that no longer exist. But the body does not feel entirely like that. It works, often remarkably well, yet not with the smooth precision of something built only for the present moment. It carries older rhythms, older reactions, older ways of maintaining balance. This is not a flaw in the dramatic sense. It is a sign that the body was not created all at once for a single world. It was assembled slowly across time, and each stage left something behind. If we move back toward the earliest origins of our species, this becomes easier to understand. Human life did not develop inside stable conditions. It developed across changing climates, different landscapes, shifting food sources, and repeated pressures that required adjustment. The body did not answer these pressures by replacing itself completely each time conditions changed. Instead, it layered new responses onto older ones. What had once helped survival was not easily discarded. It remained, adapted, or was absorbed into a broader system. Over very long periods, this created a body that is less like a single design and more like a structure built in stages. Some of those stages belong to the history of Homo sapiens directly. Others may reflect contact with human groups who were adapting under different conditions in different parts of the world. If we bring back the Denisovan example, this layered structure becomes more concrete. Denisovan-related genetic traces in some modern populations do not sit outside the body like additions that can be separated out. They are integrated into the same biological system that manages breathing, circulation, immunity, and response to environmental stress. That integration matters. It means the body is not carrying the past as a collection of detached fragments. It is carrying the past as a joined system, where older influences continue to operate inside newer contexts. This makes the body feel less like a pure inheritance from one line and more like a historical structure in which multiple periods remain present at once. If we return again to the present moment, the effects of this layering can be sensed not as visible divisions, but as quiet continuities. The body still reacts to cold in ways shaped by long histories of heat loss and energy conservation. It still responds to reduced oxygen through systems built for survival under varying conditions. It still manages biological threat through immune patterns shaped across deep time. These responses are unified in experience, but they do not all come from the same immediate context. Some belong to environmental worlds very different from the one most people now inhabit, and some may reflect adaptations that did not arise in a single population alone, but entered through contact between groups whose separate histories later became part of the same body. This does not mean that the body is confused or unfinished. It means that the body is cumulative. It keeps what has been absorbed into its functioning, even after the conditions that shape those responses have faded. In that sense, the body resembles an old landscape more than a new machine. A landscape holds traces of many periods at once. Older layers remain beneath newer surfaces. Earlier movements of water, wind, and stone continue to shape what exists now, even when the original forces are gone. The body works in a similar way. It does not erase its past completely. It builds on it, carries it, and sometimes reveals it in moments when present conditions call older responses back into use. If we move once more toward the deeper beginning of the human story, this layered view also changes how time itself appears inside the body. The body is not simply living in one historical moment. It is a meeting place of many moments. Ancient climates, older migrations, long separations between human groups, and occasional crossings between them may all remain faintly present within its functions. That presence is not symbolic. It is biological. It exists in the way systems respond, regulate, and persist. The Denisovan trace becomes meaningful here not only as evidence of one lost group, but as a sign that the human body is built from more than a single uninterrupted thread. It is built from continuities that overlapped, merged, and were carried forward together. And if that is true, then the body you experience today is not only alive in the present, it is also holding older worlds inside its structure, not as memories you can recall, but as layers still quietly active, still shaping what the body can do, long after the people and places that formed those layers have disappeared from the visible earth. If the body carries these layers quietly, it also carries the limits that come with them. Not limits in a strict or obvious sense, but small boundaries in how the body responds, adapts, and maintains balance. These boundaries are not always noticeable in daily life. They do not appear as clear restrictions that can be easily defined. Instead, they emerge in moments where the body meets a condition that does not fully match the environments in which its patterns were formed. In those moments, the response may feel slightly strained, slightly delayed, or simply less efficient than expected. This does not mean the body is failing. It means the body is working within a system shaped by conditions that are no longer entirely present. If we move back toward the earlier stages of human history, this becomes easier to understand. The environments that shaped the body were not stable or uniform. They varied across regions and across time, requiring different kinds of responses. Some adaptations were formed under conditions of scarcity, others under conditions of cold, others under conditions where oxygen was limited or where biological exposure was constant. These adaptations were not designed to work together in a perfectly unified way. They were shaped separately, in different contexts, and later brought together through movement and interaction between populations. When these different layers were combined, the result was not a perfect system optimized for a single environment. It was a system capable of functioning across a range of conditions, but not always with complete alignment to any one of them. If we return to the present, this creates a subtle tension within the body. The body continues to operate using patterns that were shaped in older environments, even when those environments are no longer part of everyday life. This tension is not dramatic. It is quiet, often unnoticed, but it can be felt in small ways. A sensitivity to temperature that seems slightly out of place, a response to altitude that varies more than expected, a pattern of fatigue or recovery that does not align neatly with modern routines. These are not errors in a simple sense. They are expressions of a system that carries forward multiple histories at once. The presence of Denisovan genetic influences within this system adds another layer to that complexity. These influences do not create entirely new responses on their own. They interact with other inherited patterns, contributing to the overall way the body adjusts. In some environments, they may align more closely with present conditions supporting certain responses. In others, they may remain less active, part of the background rather than the foreground of the body's functioning. This variability reflects the fact that the body was not shaped for a single, stable world. It was shaped for a world that changed, sometimes slowly, sometimes abruptly. As a result, It carries forward a range of responses that do not always fit perfectly within modern conditions. If we consider this carefully, the idea of the body as a layered structure becomes more precise. It is not only a collection of adaptations, it is also a collection of limits, boundaries that reflect the contexts in which those adaptations were formed. These limits are not fixed in a rigid way. The body can adjust, learn, and respond over time, but the deeper patterns remain, influencing how those adjustments take place. This does not suggest that the body is misaligned in a way that needs correction. It suggests that the body is continuous. It carries forward what has been integrated, even when the original context has changed. Within that continuity, the influence of Denisovan-related genetic material becomes one example of how different histories can contribute not only to what the body can do, but also to how it is constrained. These contributions are not separate or identifiable in everyday experience. They are part of the same system that allows the body to function at all, but they remind us that the body is not a simple reflection of the present. It is a structure shaped by many environments, many conditions, and moments of interaction that left traces still active within it. And because of that, the body does not always respond in ways that feel perfectly aligned with the world it now inhabits. It responds as something that has carried its past forward, not leaving it behind, but continuing to operate within its quiet influence, even when the world around it has changed. If these layers continue to shape the body, then the idea of balance becomes more complex than it first appears. Balance is often understood as a stable state, something the body reaches and maintains. But in reality, balance is a process, a continuous adjustment between what the body carries and what the environment requires. When those two do not fully align, the body does not stop functioning. It adapts, compensates, and continues, even if the adjustment is not perfect. This is where the deeper history of the body becomes most visible, not as something we can see directly, but as something we can feel in the way the body responds over time. If we move back again toward the earlier stages of human development, we return to a world where balance was never fixed. Conditions change too often and too gradually for the body to settle into a single, stable pattern. Instead, the body developed ways to move between different states, to adjust its responses depending on what was needed. These adjustments were not designed with a future world in mind. They were shaped by immediate pressures, by survival in the moment, and by the gradual accumulation of what allowed continuity. When different human groups, each shaped by their own environments, came into contact, the combination of their adaptations added another layer to this process. The body did not choose which influences to keep. It carried forward what became integrated into its functioning. Over time, this created a system that holds multiple possibilities, not all of which are equally suited to every environment. If we return to the present, this becomes easier to recognize in the quiet variability of how bodies respond. Some adjustments happen quickly, others more slowly. Some feel natural, others require effort. This variability is not a sign of inconsistency. It reflects the fact that the body is not built from a single, uniform set of responses. It is built from a history that includes multiple conditions, multiple adaptations, and moments where different paths came together. The influence of Denisovan genetic material fits into this pattern as one of many contributions that shape how the body moves between different states of balance. It does not define the system on its own, and it does not act separately from other influences, but it becomes part of the range of responses the body can draw upon when conditions change. This range is what allows the body to continue functioning across environments that differ from those in which its patterns were formed. But it also means that the body may never feel perfectly aligned with any single environment. There is always a slight adjustment taking place, a quiet negotiation between past and present. This negotiation is not something the body resolves once and then leaves behind. It continues across time, across generations, as new conditions are added and older patterns remain. The body becomes a place where these different layers meet, not in conflict, but in a continuous process of adjustment. Some responses become more active, others recede, but none are entirely erased. If we consider this carefully, the idea that the body still remembers a species that has disappeared begins to feel less abstract and more grounded. The body is not remembering in the sense of recalling an image or a story. It is maintaining a set of responses that were shaped in a time when that species was part of the world. Those responses have been carried forward, integrated, and reshaped, but not entirely lost. They remain within the system, influencing how the body moves between states of balance, even when the original conditions are no longer present. This does not mean that the past controls the present. It means that the present is built upon the past in ways that are not always visible. The body does not separate these layers. It holds them together, allowing them to function as a unified whole. And within that whole, the traces of earlier human groups, including the Denisovans, may still be present, not as something separate, but as part of the quiet continuity that allows the body to adjust, persist, and remain alive in a world that continues to change. If the body carries all of this quietly, then what remains most difficult to notice is not the presence of these layers, but the absence of any clear sign that they are there. The body does not announce its history. It does not separate its functions into parts that can be traced back to different moments in time. Everything feels immediate, unified, and entirely present. When you breathe, when you adjust to temperature, when your body responds to its surroundings, there is no sense that these responses come from different sources. They feel like a single continuous process. This is what makes the deeper structure of the body so easy to overlook. The continuity is complete enough that the complexity beneath it disappears from view. If we move back once more toward the origins of this structure, this lack of visibility begins to make sense. The processes that shaped the body did not leave behind clear markers for future awareness. They were not designed to be recognized or remembered. They were shaped by survival, by repeated responses to conditions that required adjustment. Over time, what worked was carried forward, integrated into the system, and made part of its normal functioning. There was no need for the body to preserve the origin of each response. It only needed to preserve the response itself. This means that the body operates without distinguishing between what is recent and what is ancient. A response shaped thousands of years ago is experienced in the same way as one shaped more recently. They are both part of the present system, and they function without drawing attention to their origins. If we return again to the present moment, this creates a quiet gap between what the body is and what we can perceive about it. The body contains more history than it reveals. It carries forward influences from environments that no longer exist, and from human groups that are no longer present as distinct populations. But none of this appears directly in ordinary experience. It remains below the level of awareness, expressed only through function. This is why the idea that the body still remembers a species that has disappeared can feel difficult to grasp at first. There is no sensation that points to it, no visible feature that marks it clearly. The body does not present itself as a mixture of histories. It presents itself as a single, complete form. Yet when examined carefully, through methods that can detect patterns not visible to the senses, a different picture emerges. The continuity of the body includes contributions from multiple sources, integrated so completely that they no longer appear separate. The Denisovan traces we have considered are one example of this. They are not visible in the way we usually think of presence. They do not appear as distinct features that can be recognized without study, but they can be detected through the structure of the genome, and their influence can be observed in certain biological responses. This does not mean that every aspect of the body can be explained through these traces. It means that the body includes them as part of a larger system, one that has been shaped by more than a single path. If we consider this slowly, the meaning of disappearance begins to change. A group can disappear from the visible world, leaving behind no continuous population that can be directly observed. And yet, some part of that group may continue, not as a visible presence, but as an influence within another body. This influence does not preserve the group in its original form. It becomes part of something else, absorbed into a system that continues to function without showing where each part came from. The body becomes a place where the past is not displayed, but carried. Not remembered in the way we remember events, but maintained in the way a system maintains its ability to respond. If we move back toward the question that has been present from the beginning, this is where it begins to settle into a clearer shape. The body does not remember in images or stories. It remembers in patterns, in responses that continue to operate because they were once part of survival. And if those patterns include contributions from a human group that has disappeared as a visible population, then the body is not only living in the present, it is also continuing something that did not entirely vanish. Not in a way that can be felt directly, but in a way that can still be observed, measured, and traced within the quiet structure of how the body works. If the body does not reveal these layers directly, then understanding them requires a different kind of attention. Not attention focused on what can be immediately felt, but attention directed toward patterns that only become visible when many observations are placed together. This is how the deeper structure of the body begins to appear, not as something obvious in a single moment, but as something that can be traced when information is compared across time, across populations, and across different environments. The body itself does not explain where its patterns come from, it simply continues to use them. To see beyond that, a slower and more careful way of looking is needed. If we move back toward the origins of this way of understanding, it begins with a simple recognition. The body carries information in a form that is not visible to the senses. That information is preserved in the structure of DNA, passed from one generation to the next, not as a narrative, but as a sequence that can be compared and studied. When these sequences are examined across many individuals, differences begin to appear. Most of these differences can be explained through known processes of variation and inheritance, but some patterns stand out because they do not fit easily within those explanations. They suggest connections that extend beyond a single, uninterrupted line. This is where the idea of Denisovan traces becomes clearer, not as a concept, but as an observable pattern. Certain segments of DNA found in some modern human populations align more closely with Denisovan sequences than with those typical of Homo sapiens alone. This alignment is not based on assumption. It is based on measurable similarity, identified through methods that allow detailed comparison at the level of genetic structure. These methods do not rely on imagination or interpretation in the ordinary sense. They rely on patterns that can be repeated, verified, and tested against different sets of data. This is why the conclusion remains careful. It does not claim that the body is something entirely different from what it appears to be. It does not suggest that modern humans are divided into hidden categories. It simply shows that the history carried within the body includes contributions that can be traced to groups that are no longer present as distinct populations. If we return to the present, this way of understanding creates a quiet shift in perspective. The body remains the same in how it feels and functions. Nothing changes in the immediate experience, but the interpretation of that experience becomes more layered. The body is no longer seen as the result of a single path, but as the result of a process that included moments of contact, exchange, and integration. These moments are not visible in everyday life. They are not preserved as memories or stories, but they remain within the structure of the body in a form that can be detected when examined carefully. This does not require that every detail be known. There are still many uncertainties, and careful study continues to refine what can be understood. But the broader pattern is stable. The body carries more history than it shows, and some of that history includes connections to human groups that have disappeared in their original form. If we consider this carefully, the meaning of knowledge itself begins to shift slightly. Knowing the body is not only about feeling it or observing it directly, it is also about recognizing that there are layers that cannot be accessed through ordinary perception. These layers require a different approach, one that looks for patterns rather than immediate evidence. And when those patterns are found, they reveal that the body is not only a present form, but also a record of interactions that extend far beyond what can be seen. The Denisovan traces are one example of this, not because they are the only ones, but because they make the idea visible in a way that can be carefully supported by evidence. They show that disappearance does not always remove all connection, and that the body can carry forward influences from a past that is no longer directly accessible. And if that is the case, then the body you experience now is not only what it seems to be on the surface, it is also a structure that holds patterns shaped across deep time, patterns that continue to exist quietly, even when the world that formed them has already faded beyond recognition. If everything we have followed is brought together quietly, without trying to force a final answer too quickly, what remains is not a dramatic revelation, but a shift in how the body can be understood. The body is not a record that tells its story directly. It does not present its past in a way that can be easily read or fully known. It continues, it functions, it responds, And in doing so, it carries forward patterns that were shaped long before the present moment, patterns that remain active even when their origins are no longer visible in the world around us. If we move back once more to the beginning of this question, the idea that your body still remembers something that has disappeared no longer needs to be understood as a metaphor. It becomes a careful description of continuity. The body does not remember in the way the mind remembers. It does not recall images, events, or identities. It maintains responses. It carries forward structures that were shaped in different environments, across different populations, and at times through contact between those populations. Those structures have been integrated so completely that they no longer appear separate. They are experienced as part of a single, unified system, even though their origins are more complex than that unity suggests. If we return to the Denisovans, their role in this story becomes clearer in a quiet way. They are not present as a hidden population within the modern world. They are not something that exists alongside you in a visible form. But the evidence suggests that some of their genetic traces continue within certain human populations today. Those traces are not complete. They do not preserve the Denisovans as they once were. They exist only as small segments, integrated into the larger structure of the human genome. Yet even in that reduced form, they represent something important. They show that disappearance does not always mean complete absence. A human group can vanish as a distinct population and still remain as part of the biological continuity of another. This does not change the identity of the body in a direct or visible way. It does not divide the body into separate histories that can be felt or observed without careful study. But it does change the meaning of what the body contains. The body becomes not only a continuation of a single path, but a place where different paths have met and been carried forward together. If we consider this slowly, the idea of the present begins to expand slightly. The body you experience now is not only shaped by the conditions you live in today, it is shaped by conditions that existed long before you, by environments that have changed or disappeared, and by interactions between human groups that are no longer visible in the world. These influences do not appear as something foreign. They are part of how the body functions. They are part of what allows it to respond, to adjust, and to remain alive. This does not mean that everything about the body can be traced back with certainty. There are limits to what can be known, and careful study continues to refine what can be understood, but the broader pattern remains stable. The body carries more history than it reveals, and some of that history includes connections to human groups that have disappeared in their original form. If we return one final time to the question itself, it no longer stands as something distant or abstract. It becomes something that rests quietly within the body, not as a visible memory, not as a separate identity, but as a continuity of function. The body does not tell you what it remembers. It shows you through the way it continues to respond using patterns shaped across deep time. And if those patterns include contributions from a species that has disappeared, then the body is not only living in the present, it is also continuing something that did not entirely vanish. Not in a way that can be fully seen or fully known, but in a way that can still be observed carefully within the structure of how the body works. And if the body can carry forward something that no longer exists in the world as a visible form, then what part of you truly belongs only to the present, and what part of you is still quietly continuing a history that has no clear end?